John Hook's Newsmaker starts now.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmaker. This week we learned that the popular DNA testing company 23andMe is filing for bankruptcy. If you have submitted DNA to the company's database, you may want to consider deleting your information, because if the company is eventually sold, who knows where your DNA profile might end up. And with 7 million customers and counting profiles, this affects a lot of people. But beyond that, law enforcement has broken huge cases dipping into these types of databases to find killers and rapists. It's become a game changer for law enforcement. And who better to talk about this than, well, she's been described as a godmother of familial DNA, Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, an internationally recognized forensic genealogist. Her work has cracked the Canal murders case here in Phoenix and many others. She identified a 2-year-old child who died in the Titanic disaster. Her work has helped solve dozens of cold cases. She's the founder and president of Identifinders. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, great to see you again.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me.
I suspect you're a little bit agnostic on the 23andMe question, but I have to ask you, because you use that database, I'm sure. What is your advice to people out there? Because I think a lot of people are wondering, well, if this company dissolves or something happens, what happens to my stuff? What would you tell them?
Well, first of all, I want to make clear we don't use 23andMe for our forensic investigations.
Oh, you don't?
It's off limit. No, we don't use 23andMe and we don't use Ancestry. We can't, because the system is set up for handling samples that are saliva samples. People spit in little cups and send them in. So the system's set up for mass production on that level, so on those kind of samples. And we don't have those from the crime lab. You know, we'll have blood, we'll have semen, whatever, but not saliva from a John Doe or a violent offender as a rule. So
that's interesting. I thought you guys were able to access those databases.
No. What happens is when you test with one of those companies, you can download your data, your raw data, and it's a small file on your hard drive, and you can upload it to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, which are the databases we can use. Now, GEDmatch, they don't provide testing. All they do is provide a database where people can search for more relatives. In other words, if I test with 23andMe, I get certain products, certain data, certain results, and I can download, but I can only see people from 23andMe. So if I'm an adoptee, for example, and I want to have more matches, find more information, I can download my data, upload it to GEDmatch, and that gives me another fishing hole to fish in, because people in Ancestry, 23andMe, Family Tree, MyHeritage, all can do the same thing, so I can see people that just did the same thing I did from other companies.
Okay, I understand. So what you're telling me is you can't really do DNA work through that, but you can use that to kind of close the circle of a potential family member, right? You can get in there, and that's helpful.
Yeah, right. No, I can't. That would be somebody taking a private test for, health reasons or because they're adopted. We wouldn't use it for forensic cases directly. We would have to have that person download their results, put it in one of the databases we can use, and opt in if that was appropriate, and allow us to use that even after they're in that database.
So Colleen, again, what would you do if you were one of these people who's got this information out there on say 23andMe and the company's teetering? What would you tell them? What would your advice, because you're an expert in this area?
I would maybe wait just a little bit right now to see what happens, how it sorts out, because if Ann Morjicki is able to recover, maybe things will go back in place. We don't know yet, so I'd wait a little bit. However, if you are in 23andMe, whether you do stay or not, you could download your results and you could upload them in GEDmatch if you want and continue working. You wouldn't get the health benefits, you'd do recreational genealogy basically, but you'd still have use of your data. So, and we wouldn't necessarily need it for forensics. You could do your genealogy on it and avoid the, law enforcement if you wanted in certain ways. So I would say wait and see if you delete it from 23andMe, but either way, download your results so you have them yourself, and you can put them on GEDmatch if you want to continue your work.
Got it. Okay, your work in the criminal area. Can you just go back to the beginning of how you arrived at this? Because you were a nuclear physicist, as I recall. I mean, you have a whole elaborate, very highly credentialed background, and then you venture into this area. How did it start?
I was actually in nuclear physics first. I did lasers. I worked for NASA as a contractor, in the Department of Defense. But at one point, I had my own company. We were struggling. And recreationally, I wrote a book called Forensic Genealogy. And I thought, okay, this is my therapy. But it turned into my new career because once I had that book and I kind of started getting real forensic work, I found out I had a knack for it, folks. So there it is.
Let me ask you about a couple of the cases you've worked on here locally. Two that really come to mind. Obviously, the canal killer, Brian Patrick Miller, identified through familial DNA. Can you walk me through how that process works? Because you're really closing the concentric circles of a family. And this opens up a whole new world because you don't have to have that person's DNA, but if you can link it to a family, you can start to close the circle. Describe how it happens.
Well, first of all, I'd like to make one correction. What I do is not familial DNA, it's genetic genealogy, forensic genetic genealogy, and it's real different. Familial DNA refers to a certain way you use CODIS in the legal system. So to clear up the terminology so that people out there will understand it's different. So we call it FGG, it's called FIG in some places. Now, in those days, in 2015, with the canal murders, it was very primitive. We didn't have like what I call the big genealogy today. All I had to use was the Y DNA, which is the male DNA. And because, the genealogy community uses the same markers as the forensic community, I realized at one point that a law enforcement agency could even give me a PDF of a Y profile, the data, and I could compare that to the genealogy databases without really having any DNA change hands or anything. I just needed that data. I'd put it in some proprietary software. I'd match it to the genealogy databases. And genealogists were using Y-DNA for already 15 years because that's the Y-DNA follows the family line like the family name. So that if I took a forensic profile, compared it to genealogy data, and I came up, a match would indicate a possible last name for the assailant, then if the name was Fitzpatrick, you'd look in heaven forbid, you'd look in the case file for Fitzpatrick and see if you had a suspect like that.
Well, even worse in this case, you come up with Miller, right? Brian Patrick Miller becomes the suspect, but Miller, I mean, how many Millers are out there in the greater Phoenix area?
Correct. However, now you have to understand, at that point, with that primitive technology, all I could do was come up with an ethnicity like Caucasian, African American, so on, and maybe a last name. So I came up to a match with 6 Millers in the genealogy databases. So I said, well, the guy's possible last name's Miller. Could be wrong, could have been adopted, I don't know, but that's my results. I turned them into the Phoenix Police Department and looked through the case file. There were 5 Millers. He didn't have to be there, but there were 5 Millers. And there was one guy that stood out above the rest, and that was Brian Patrick Miller.
Yeah, I covered the murder of Melanie Burness in 1993. That was horrific.
Yeah.
And then a year before that, it had been Angela Brasso. Yeah. Terrible case and a lot of unanswered questions for 20 years.
Yeah, right. And so he didn't have to be in there, but when, let's say Brian Patrick Miller looked really interesting, a person of interest, because he was kind of eccentric. You can believe that. And so I found out later that, the police didn't know what to make of this. DNA, get a name out of DNA, okay. And they were just going through the motions, thinking, okay, this is a reasonable lead. It's the next one. And I think maybe they thought it was like a psychic, dreaming up what the name might be. I've heard what I was doing was weird and snake oil, but it wasn't. And they met Brian Patrick Miller. They got his DNA sample and they said, this can't be the guy. He's so nice. And he brought his 14-year-old daughter everywhere he went. This can't be it. And they say, okay, this is just the next thing we're going to investigate. And then, one day they got a call from the DNA lab saying, hey, let's get together. And it was like, oh, yeah, okay, you want a raise, I'm sure. Come on over, we'll talk about overtime. And it was like, oh, no,
Yeah.
that's not why we want to talk to you.
Colleen, do you still marvel at the fact that predators are kind of mingling around us in our orbit and we have no idea?
Well, that's human nature. That's probably been going on since cavemen. We're mingling with other cavemen. That's the way we live, and we just have to depend on our law enforcement agencies to keep us safe. Let's hope, this new technique, this FGG stuff, helps with that, helps identify even some of those old timers that aren't around anymore. I just did a survey a couple of years ago on how many minimum percent, how many cases that have been solved could only have been solved using genealogy. Only, and that's 37% minimum, and it's probably a lot higher than that.
This is the future, and the future is now, right? In other words, if
Right.
somebody commits a crime, there is now a pathway to identify them.
Well, you have to have DNA.
You have to have DNA, yes.
Okay, you have to have that. If you don't have any DNA, I may not be able to help you. I can brainstorm, but if, the DNA is the big development.
Tell me about the Allison Feldman case. This is a young woman who was murdered in her home in Scottsdale. And again, police were at a complete dead end, it seemed. And then you get on board. What happened?
Well, in Allison's case, it was really interesting because this happened right after the Phoenix Canal broke, okay? So I was approached by John Heinzelman in Scottsdale. I did the same thing. I took the Y profile, ran it through my software, got matches to the name Meacham. So the detectives looked through the case file. Oh, no Meachams. Okay, so, keep it as a lead. In the meantime, they initiated the first familial search. Remember the term, familial search.
I know.
In,
Yes.
in the state of Arizona. And it took a while. It took almost 2 years to get that in place legally. And they ran the CODIS profile, the profile from the crime scene against the CODIS database. And in familial matching, you're not looking for an exact match. You're looking for an almost exact match that might indicate a family member. And in this case, they came up with a guy who had been in prison at the time of the murder, so it couldn't be him, but they're not looking for him. They're looking for a close relative. So they discovered that his brother had been arrested for felony DUI, and there was a blood sample available. And it had been sampled for blood alcohol level,
Yeah,
but
DUI.
not for DNA.
Yep.
So they went ahead, tested it for DNA, and his name was Ian L. Mitchum. So I would say
Unbelievable.
that my results were fine. It's just and familial search results were great. The question is who was in the database to match it against. The case file didn't have the person they were looking for, but the CODIS database did. And that's why, and both methods are great. They don't compete with one another. They should both be used, whatever's convenient to be used first.
She is the founder and president of Identifinders, Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, who is a pioneer in forensic genealogy. And she solved a bunch of cases. We're going to get into more of them with Colleen when we come back on Newsmaker. Welcome back on Newsmaker. She's the founder and president of Identifinders, Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. She is a forensic genealogist who has pioneered this incredible technology of finding suspects through using what I call familial DNA, but she doesn't like that term, forensic genealogy. Colleen, great to have you back after the break.
Thank you.
You worked on the remains of an unknown child aboard Titanic. How did that come to be? How did that come to pass, and how did you figure out who that little, I think, 2-year-old girl was?
Well, in that case, I had already been working with the Armed Forces DNA Identification Lab. My first forensic case ever really was the identification of the hand in the snow, which was a hand found in a glacier in Alaska that was presumed to be from a plane wreck in 1948, a
Right, Northwest
military.
Flight 4422.
Right. And so because I got involved, there were 30 victims and we got it down. We ruled out 29. So we got down to that last one and we had to obviously find his family and get the DNA and compare it to the DNA in the hand. And that was pretty tough because his mother was from Ireland. And because of the type of DNA, we had to pursue his mother's line. So I've been doing Irish research for, at the time, 50 years maybe. So, I put the pedal to the metal and I was able to find that one man in Ireland who could give that sample to identify that hand. Really interesting story for another time. So, when that was over, of course, the next one was they happened to be working on the unknown child in the Titanic. And this was actually a little boy who was
Oh, it's
about
a
two
little
years
boy.
old,
Okay.
found in the wreck of the Titanic in 1912. And there were 6 children that matched on the manifest that matched that description. And by DNA, 2 were immediately ruled out. 2 more, I think 4 totally were ruled out, but two had identical DNA profiles to the level they were tested. And so it took multiple rounds of testing, multiple rounds of research. So I helped with, in that case, I was not involved in the DNA because the Armed Forces Lab, AFDIL, took care of that. But I had to help trace the families to get the DNA sample. Now, in that case, I did Y-DNA, finding the male line to be able to compare a living person's DNA to the baby's or to the remains. And in that case, unfortunately, there was no male DNA left because the remains were 100 years old, 90, 100, they really couldn't do that. They couldn't get that DNA. However, I went along for the ride. It helped a lot of other ways. And we were able to finally identify the baby as Sidney Leslie Goodwin from Melksham, England. He and his mother, father, and the 6 children, including Sidney, were killed on the Titanic.
Unbelievable. When you approach families with this information, are they generally cooperative or does it take some finesse?
Well, it depends on what information. If I approach somebody, say, whatever we do, we have to do genealogy. You must understand that.
Yeah.
Somehow we build a family tree. Oh my God, there's the answer. That's that guy, John Smith from Poughkeepsie. All right, whatever we do. So in building the tree, occasionally we have to contact a family member about something. If I or my team, my people contact him, it's not going to be a close relative to who we're trying to identify, because we don't want to just shock the family, right? So in that case, I say, hey, we're working on a forensic case. Can you help us? Would you mind taking like a DNA test to target, to let us see where you fit so we know we're going in the right direction? And I would say 99 out of 100 people are okay with it.
No
We
kidding.
say you're not a close relative. Now, when we get close, say like we just did solved the case yesterday. We turned in the name of the guy, a murder case a few days ago. In that case, we wouldn't be contacting any family members, close family members. We would leave that to the agency unless they asked us to assist. That's for them. And we'll coach them, we'll talk and we'll say, this is how you might want to approach these people. We help. So if it's close, we normally don't do it. When it's more distant, we get the agency to give us permission so we don't have to call them every time we need to get a target test from a family member.
Tell me about your work on Amelia Earhart. That is one of the most vexing cases of what happened to her on that flight. It remains a mystery, but do you think we're any closer to solving it?
Well, that's out of my hands. That's for the people that go to the South Pacific
Yeah,
and what is it, Ocean's Infinity, whatever they're doing. That's for people to go to Gardner Island and Nicomomoro Island. What I did when she disappeared with her navigator, Fred Noonan.
right.
Amelia's family is pretty well known. You can get a DNA sample from them. You can find them. But Fred was, I think he was divorced twice or separated twice. He didn't have any children. His mother died when he was 4 in like 1896. So you get that in you have to do the female line because of the kind of DNA. And, her mother's name was Green. So, and they were from the UK. So I'd say that to trace that relative, it took me over a year. And if you lay out the family tree, it's like 25, 8.5 by 11 pages sideways by 3 deep. And he's on one corner and this other person's on the other corner, and
Oh
they
my.
link just the right way to get the DNA.
So you've got to have incredible patience to do this kind of work.
I stay up a lot late at night.
Is it a calling for you? It has to be.
Well, it is. And, I'm really happy because I'm wondering why I got all that education. It was puzzling for a while. And now I'm glad to say I'm putting it toward helping other people. I'm hanging in there. I'm using, the brain power I've given on this earth to reach out and bring answers to people that have been waiting, sometimes for decades. It's not closure. There's no such thing as closure.
Totally agree.
What we can bring is release
Yes.
and answers.
Colleen, as you've done this now for many years, would you say there are people out there, you know that this is true. There are people who've committed crimes, and maybe it's been 20 or 30 years, and they think, no way, I am in the clear. They're not anymore.
Not if they left DNA at the scene. You're on the list. Somehow we'll get around. If there's DNA there, this is becoming more and more useful every day, more and more with less and less. And, your case, your murder might come up to the top any day.
Isn't that incredible? I mean, you're solving, a lot of your work is helping solve some really old cases that hung around. I mean, we're going back 40 years sometimes and even longer.
Yeah, right. 40, 50 years. Our oldest case is 1948. That was a Somerton man in Australia. And it's been older, but for now, we're working on some older ones, but for now. And then The Boy in the Box is a really good one from I think 1957. The Boy in the Box from Philadelphia was I had to go to 3 countries to get the right DNA labs to work on it.
Who pays you to do that kind of travel?
I didn't go. I had to go for the technology. I had to network and get my contacts to okay working on it. I didn't have to go to the lab. I could get on Zoom or a call and do it that way. We had to send the DNA out, of course, but I didn't have to go there.
Are you flooded now with requests from police agencies?
We are. Let's say sometimes we are, sometimes we have lulls, but yes, we have a lot of work. We do.
So once you've got DNA, you can start to go into the forensic genealogy and dive in and start to close the circles.
Correct. What we do is we have the DNA set up a certain way. We put it in the database and we get a list of DNA cousins to our unknown person. Because the people are related to the person, they have to be related to each other in some way by marriage or blood. So it's like a big Sudoku puzzle. We take all those people, we, get them diagonal, horizontal, vertical, all self-consistent in their relationships. And in the end, there's one piece missing, and that's the person we're looking for.
Unbelievable.
It's right in there.
Colleen, I could talk to you for 2 hours, but I don't want to take up your time.
It's okay.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I appreciate being asked. Usually I'm just working. I don't get asked.
No, this is terrific. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, forensic genealogist. I will try not to say familial DNA anymore. I'm going to have to break that habit. Thank you so much. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Talk soon.
Likewise, I hope so. We're back in a minute on Newsmaker. Thanks again to Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, forensic genealogist. What a fascinating half hour. Hope you enjoyed it as well. We'll see you next week on Newsmaker.